Well, the Sabbath was over, finally. It had been the longest Sabbath, the longest Saturday in the history of Judaism. At least it felt that way to this group of women. And you could hardly blame them. They had been through so much that last week, from shouts of Hosanna as Jesus entered Jerusalem to cries of crucify him several days later, to watching Jesus go through these sham trials and trying to carry his cross to the place of his execution. Some of those women had stood at the foot of the cross and watched as their friend, their rabbi, their son was executed on a cross. They even followed these two men who negotiated for Jesus' body and hastily made preparation for his burial, for that funeral. And they followed those men as they took the body of Jesus to the tomb and laid him in the place. They saw the stone rolled into place. They had waited over an hour after hour thinking about what they could do. You knew that they were trying to rectify all the mistakes that had made in tradition along the way in Jesus' funeral. They were probably compiling a list of all the things these men messed up and that they wanted to fix, and they just couldn't get to it because of the Sabbath. Finally, the sun started to rise, and they made their way to the marketplace. Maybe they knew a vendor who opened early, or maybe they just knew a vendor who wouldn't mind their knock on the door, and he would sell the spices that they needed to anoint the body of Jesus. And so they found that vendor, and they bought the spices, and they followed that route they had previously traveled back to the tomb. And along the way, they started to ask some questions. They weren't pondering the big questions, really. They weren't asking each other, why did this happen to Jesus? Why did this happen to our rabbi? Why did this happen to my son? What's next for us? What's next for his disciples? Are they going to be rounded up soon? Will they be arrested? What sort of punishment will they face? They weren't asking the really big questions. They were concerned with the here and now. This big rock was rolled in front of the tomb, and they needed access to the body of Jesus. Who would roll the stone away? They had heard that guards were posted there, and would those guards even allow them to get close to the grave at all? Would they be able to lay their hands on that stone and effort to try to move that stone away? Would they even be able to get close enough to do that? As they traveled to the tomb, I wonder if the conversation got quiet or if it got more excited as they thought about all the challenges ahead, and as they realized that some things were just out of their control. As the closer they got to the grave, I wonder if they more and more realized that without him, they were powerless. My wife was pregnant with our first daughter, and it had been an up and down pregnancy. We some difficulties, and there was a surgery, and we thought everything was okay. And at the next checkup, everything wasn't okay. And the doctor said, "Man, you need to go to the hospital right away." And so we were in the hospital, and the doctors were talking about we need to take Sherry and the baby to the hospital in Phoenix, and hopefully they can handle it a little better than we can. We were living in Yuma, Arizona, 3 hours away from Phoenix at the time, and so they were getting ready to do this, and it happened to be on a Sunday morning. And as a youth pastor, I headed to church early that morning, probably due to some last minute things I had put off or whatever. I wanted to make sure that the youth coaches would be able to handle Sunday school and the youth activities for the day. And I went back to the hospital, and I was in the room with Sherry, and there was a knock at the door, and there was a police officer at the door, and they said, "Mr. Kaufman, that's never good." And I went out to the hallway, and the police officer said, "Do you live at this address?" I said, "Yeah, we live there." And she said, "Well, your house is on fire." And I said, "Shut up." And then I left the hospital and I went to the condo complex where we were living, and sure enough, it was on fire. I happened to know a couple of the firemen. They went to church with us, and I said, hey, you guys got this? Because I don't think there's much I can do. And they said, yeah, well, we'll let you know. And I headed off to Phoenix to meet Sherry. They were flying Sherry to Phoenix that day, and I started to drive the 3 hours across the desert. I was driving at the time this Ford Taurus station wagon that we had bought from a missionary on furlough, and so while we considered that car to be blessed, it was still used, and I thought, man, I hope I make it across the desert. This is not the day we want to blow a hose, and I started to think about all the things that might happen and the questions that I didn't have answers for. I thought, what am I going to say to my wife by way of encouragement and support when I get there? What am I going to do? How long will we have to stay in this hospital? I started to do the math backwards from 9 months, and will we be there this entire time? And how are we going to manage that 3 hours from home and with all the ministry concerns and things going on? And I just had so many questions. I had way more questions than I had answers. And on that 3-hour drive, I don't know if you've ever been on a drive like that, heading to or away from a crisis in your life, and the questions start to sort of flood, and you realize on a drive like that some things are simply out of your control. You realize that without Him, man, you are powerless. The women were startled. Mark has them just looking up. They just sort of arrive, like they teleported almost to the tomb, and they look up and they're startled by what they see. They're shocked by what they see because they had all these questions about how they would move this giant stone away from the entrance of the tomb. And when they arrived, the stone was already moved. I'm not sure if they were excited or scared or just thought this is a weird situation, but they were there, after all, to anoint the body of Jesus with these spices, and so they carried those spices a little closer to the tomb. I don't know if you've ever gone to a place where something just wasn't right. You came home maybe and the door was left open, or can you imagine going to a cemetery and things not being exactly the way you left them? I just have to think that they were sort of looking into every nook and cranny, every corner of that tomb, just to make sure that they were alone. And when they looked on the right side, they realized, oh man, we're not alone. There was this guy dressed in white. Matthew, in his account, says that his clothes gleamed like a bright light. And we know from Matthew that an angel had come and rolled away the stone. And so I think it's safe to presume that those women were looking at this angel sitting in that tomb. And he said something that, angels say when they meet somebody, do not be alarmed. Easier said than done, as these women are sort of peeking through their hands and trying to listen to what he said. But the next thing he said was even more outrageous. He said, I know why you're here. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. He was crucified and he was buried here, but he's not here any longer. He is risen. Come and look, the angel said. Come and look where the body was laid. For the first time, those women discovered the power of the resurrection. Well, our first daughter, Katrina, was born much too early in that hospital, and she lived for about an hour. And somewhere around the course of that hour, a hospital chaplain came to the room, and she said, is there anything I can do? Can I help in some way? And I said, I don't think so. We're going to be all right. And she said, well, I have some resources for you. And so she initially offered, she said, I have some crystals in my office, and I can bring the crystals to the room, and it'll cleanse the aura, or whatever she said about the crystals. And I said, no, I don't think we need any rocks or crystals. We're going to be all right. And you can kind of see her looking over the information. And I suppose perhaps she came to, employment in First Christian Church, youth pastor, and she thought church people. So she said, well, I can get a minister or a priest, and they can come and they can baptize Katrina. And I said, no, I don't think we need that either. I didn't get into any of the theological details with her, right? I didn't go into the fact that she was born way too early. She's much too early to make a decision on her own to follow Jesus. And besides, in this hour lifespan, she's will be without sin. I feel pretty comfortable about this. She's perfect. She's perfect. We're good. But her eyes got real big, the chaplain's eyes. Got very large, and she just sort of stared at me. And while I didn't go into any theological details, I thought maybe I should have. Maybe that was a chance to explain the difference that Jesus made once for all. Maybe I should have had a conversation with her about the power of the resurrection. Those women tried to listen to what the angel had to say. They were still awfully afraid and awfully shocked and just trying to make sense of everything that has happened over the last week, and now this empty tomb. And when the angel said, I need you to go and I need you to find Peter and the other disciples, and you tell them to meet Jesus in Galilee just like he promised. And Mark says simply that the women turned around, that they fled from the tomb. I imagine that slow walk filled with conversation on the way to the tomb was the exact opposite, the exact reverse situation on the way out of the tomb, as they ran as fast as they could, filled with fear and trembling, and they didn't say a word to each other all the way until they found the disciples. And they were motivated by that change. They were speechless as they left the tomb, overcome by the power of the resurrection. A few days later, after we returned to Yuma from Phoenix, we had a memorial service for Katrina, and I'm a terrible person because I don't remember much about that memorial service. I don't remember who spoke or if anybody did or what they said, but I remember standing in that service. We just had a time of praise and worship, and while I don't remember the worship songs that we sang, I do remember standing in that crowd of friends and family as we sang those worship songs. And I remember alternating between singing poorly, as I do, and just standing there in silence and listening to the words, and just sort of those words of hope and promise, those words of forgiveness and grace, the hope of a resurrection that someday, I never really even got to know this little girl. Someday I would have all the days to get to know her. I remember standing in that memorial service, in that worship service, listening to those songs, being overcome by the power of the resurrection. Friends, you can know Jesus. And you can know the power of his resurrection. I think Mark, the story of Jesus' resurrection in Mark chapter 16, the first 8 verses, it teaches us 3 steps to knowing Jesus and the power of his resurrection. If you have your Bibles, I'd love for you to open them up to Mark the 16th chapter. We're going to take a look at the first 8 verses, and we'll think about this story together. 3 steps to knowing Jesus and the power of his resurrection. Mark chapter 16. This is what God's word says. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. All right, 3 steps that I think we need to consider. Step number 1 is to admit that you're powerless. Our scripture begins here in Mark chapter 16 with just this little phrase, when the Sabbath was past. Now, in the series that we've been calling Power, we've been taking a look at the power of Jesus in all things, in all areas, and all through the Gospel of Mark. Mark has this one word that he really, really loves. He uses it over and over again, and it's immediately. Jesus is always immediately doing something. They're going from one place to another immediately. He's healing somebody immediately. He's being baptized immediately. Mark loves this word immediately. In fact, 41 out of the 51 times that Greek word that we translate as immediately is used in the New Testament, it's used in the Gospel of Mark. Over and over, Mark's in a hurry to get to the next place. But here we just get this weak little word, when. And it means in the past. Over the last few days, to be past or after. There's just this period of waiting that these women had to endure. Maybe you've experienced this with a loss of a loved one, or a diagnosis that's pretty hard to figure, or some other sort of hard time in your life, tragedy and crisis, and you feel like, man, I ought to be doing something. I need to do something. And at the same time, you think, well, why bother? Because nothing is going to matter. And that's sort of where these women are at. They feel like we've got to do something, and they want desperately to go and anoint and honor Jesus, who has been crucified, and just with these spices and just try to make sense of it, maybe through this act of service. But they just have to wait until after the Sabbath. And so very early the next day, verse 2 tells us, on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They made their way. They bought these spices. They made their way to the tomb. Jewish funerals, like Jewish weddings in the first century, were multi-day affairs. If you remember any of the stories about weddings, and Jesus had to provide extra wine, this miracle, right, of water to wine, because they ran out over a course of several days. They ran out of wine, and so weddings took several days. You remember the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. It's one of those odd stories where Jesus waits until his friend dies, and then waits 4 days after his death to go to Mary and Martha's house, because the funeral would still be going on. Just traditionally, what they would do is they'd leave the tomb open for several days. And over the course of those several days, there would be mourning, professional mourners sometimes. This funeral would go on, and people, loved ones, would go in and anoint the body with spices. And so that would happen over a course of several days, and then finally the tomb would be sealed. It would be sealed for a year. The family would come back after that year, and then they'd place the bones into a box. And that's traditionally what would happen. Jesus, though, situation was a little different. First, he was executed on a cross. There was a lot of shame surrounding the death of Jesus. Secondly, he was killed just before the Sabbath. He was executed just before the Sabbath. And so a couple of men, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, hastily made preparations to bury the body. And so they did it in a hurry. And then after they had buried the body in a tomb, placed it in the tomb, they went ahead and sealed that tomb up. I think because everybody was concerned about what would happen to the body of Jesus. Even the authorities, Matthew tells us, sent guards to make sure that nobody came and stole that body, that nothing happened to the body of Jesus. And so very quickly, Jesus' tomb was closed and then sealed, and that's what concerned the women as they made their way to the tomb. They just didn't know what they would do. Verse 3 says, and they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? They realized as they got closer and closer that they maybe were physically powerless to get into the tomb. They weren't going to be strong enough to get into the tomb. But I wonder, as they discuss this lack of physical authority, of this physical power, if they were also dealing with the fact and the understanding, coming to terms that they were mentally and spiritually powerless as well. Death does that, doesn't it? It kind of forces us to confront all of those issues. Eventually, we will come to our physical end. And man, that confronts our mental and spiritual powerlessness in this world. Have you ever heard somebody describe death as natural? I'm not sure if I can agree with that. Death is equal opportunity. Death is consistent. It's coming for each and every one of us, but I'm not sure I can agree with the sentiment that death is natural. Death sort of made its way in. It waltzed into our world as sin crept in, and we've been dealing with the brokenness of sin ever since. Every single one of us has to get to a point where we admit that we are powerless. In some situations, anyway. Hey, you guys recognize this, a power strip? These come in handy, don't they? We have got all these screens, all these devices we've got to charge, and maybe you need a few extra outlets to get all that stuff charged up to maximum strength. So you plug in the power cord to an outlet, and then you have all your little devices and charging up on that power cord. Very, very handy. What do you have, though, if you take that power cord and you plug it into itself? I mean, you've got nothing. You've got this nice looking black rectangle, right? It is useless. And yet, when we face crisis in our lives, sometimes even when we confront death in our life, we try to plug into our own power source, and we're left powerless. We have to admit that we are powerless without him and that we desperately need him. Step number 2 is to discover this resurrection power. Look at verses 4 through 6 here. And looking up, they saw the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw the young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe. And they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him." Now they get to the tomb and they discover some things. When is the last time you discovered something? You really, really discovered something. As I thought about that, I thought maybe in the wintertime, I wear a jacket and I put a $10 bill, I get some change, and I put that $10 bill in my jacket pocket, and then I hang it up because spring is coming. And by the next season, I take that jacket out and I put it on, and hopefully it still fits, and I reach into the pocket, and there's the $10 bill, and you pull out that $10 bill, and you think, whoa! $10! And that $10 seems like, hundreds of dollars. It's found. It's newly discovered money. And we get excited about that. Of course, discovery works the other way. Maybe you're taking your wife out to a fancy dinner, and after you drive through, you look in the bag. You look in the bag and you discover, oh, hey, we ordered 2 cheeseburgers and there's only 1 cheeseburger. And you look up at your wife and you think, are we going to share this cheeseburger? Or, you're a little sad you're missing a cheeseburger. And when's the last time you really discovered something? Well, these women, they got to the tomb and they discovered all sorts of things. The first thing they discovered is that the stone had already been rolled away. I suppose there was a mixture of relief and excitement and anxiety and worry about how in the world that had been accomplished, but they saw that the stone was rolled away. The second discovery is they go into the tomb, evidently to anoint the body of Jesus with these spices, and they see this man dressed in white, this angel sitting there, and they're startled and afraid of the angel. They discover him. And then third, they discover that Jesus wasn't there anymore. The angel explains, you've come to look for Jesus of Nazareth. He was here, but he's not here anymore. He's risen. Come and see. Come and see where they laid the body. They make this discovery of the resurrected Jesus. They get to that empty tomb and they've got to figure out, do we believe the angel? What's the best explanation for this empty tomb? Zach did a great job of mentioning already that scholars, as they study history, almost all scholars that are on the same page, they admit that there was this guy named Jesus and he was an itinerant preacher and he got in some trouble and he was executed by the Romans on a cross and he was buried in the tomb, and then the tomb came up empty. And that's where opinions start to diverge, right? They start to try to figure out, just like every single one of us, just like the women at that tomb, what's the best explanation for this empty tomb? And right away, there was a conspiracy theory that was offered. And Matthew tells us that these guards who fainted and passed out and then woke up and discovered Jesus wasn't there, and they went and told the authorities, hey, we don't know where Jesus is. And the authorities told them, you tell everyone who talks to you. They paid them off and told them, hey, you tell everyone who talks to you that the disciples came and stole the body of Jesus. So right away, one explanation for that empty tomb is that somebody stole the body of Jesus. Zach did a great job of explaining that, man, that's really hard for somebody to make up a lie and then keep that lie for that long. Chuck Colson, who some of us, if you're old enough, remember that Charles Colson was sort of the right-hand man for Richard Nixon, got in some trouble with Watergate. Later on, he would start prison fellowship and have a long ministry. He said this about the resurrection. He said, I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. Hard to believe that stolen body is the best explanation for the empty tomb. Well, what about maybe the women, just got their directions mixed up and they went to the wrong tomb and they discovered an empty tomb? Well, if that's true and somebody wanted to stop this way, this new movement, this church, this Jesus movement, then wouldn't somebody say, no, you made a mistake. You went to tomb B when you should have went to tomb A. Everybody would have known where Jesus' body was. The third explanation is maybe hallucination. I could buy into this. They had been through so much and the anxiety was high, except that every single person had the same shared hallucination. That's maybe hard to believe as the best explanation for the empty tomb. My favorite explanation is the fourth one. It's the swoon theory. This is the idea that Jesus wasn't really dead when he was executed on the cross. They just made a mistake and he was alive. They wrapped him up, buried him, wrapped up with 75 pounds of spices over this body that had been flogged and hung on a cross and stabbed in the side. And then the coolness of the tomb revived him and he walked out. And there's lots of problems with this. The first one is, can you imagine these folks mistaking a person who had been flogged and beaten within an inch of his life so much that he couldn't carry the crossbeam? Somebody else had to do that, then hung on a cross for hours, stabbed in the side, blood and water spill out, and then he's revived by the coolness of the tomb and he stumbles into the upper room and they're like, Jesus, raised from the dead. I would think something else, perhaps. But even more, this is just sort of recency bias. We have this idea that people in the ancient world, couldn't figure out things like death and life, but they knew what dead was and they knew what alive was. And by the way, these Roman soldiers in charge of execution, they were really good at doing that. They were really good at their job. This wasn't the first execution that they had overseen. Probably not the best explanation for the empty tomb. The last one is myth that it was just made up. I would say the best evidence that this isn't myth, that it's not just made up, is the fact that you can look around in this room and see people thousands and thousands of years later still acknowledging Jesus as Lord. Every single one of us has to come to terms with the best explanation for the empty tomb. And let me suggest to you today that the best explanation is the original explanation given by that angel in Mark chapter 16, that Jesus of Nazareth, he was crucified on a cross. He was buried in this tomb. You can come and see where they laid him, but he's not here any longer because he is risen. Discover that resurrection power. The third step number 3, is that we need to live in his power. Look at verses 7 through 8. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. And then they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. But go. These women had a mission, and they were sent to tell Peter and the other disciples, go and meet with Jesus. They were the very first proclaimers of the resurrection. And they turn around, and Mark says simply that they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. They were filled with fear and trembling. It's an interesting pairing of words. And it's not the first place, by the way, that Mark puts these two words together, this fear and trembling. It's a turn of phrase in the Greek, and it's kind of turn of phrase that we use in the English as well. In my Kansan, I might say, well, I'm ready to leave. I'm good and ready to leave. I don't mean that I'm both good and ready. I mean I'm especially ready to leave. Or maybe when your mom, you took that extra cookie or whatever, and your mom was a little fed up, and she said, I am sick and tired of dealing with you, Bill. Sick and tired. Well, mom didn't mean that she was both sick and tired. She meant she was especially tired. She was really, really tired. It's that sort of turn of phrase. Mark uses it a couple of times in his gospel, this fear and trembling. We find them paired here at the end of Mark chapter 16, but you go back to Mark chapter 5, verse 33. It's the story of Jesus. He's on his way to heal this guy's daughter, and he's going through town. There's a whole crowd following him, and they're just surrounding him. There's a woman in that crowd who has been sick for years and years and years, and she decides that if I get close enough to Jesus that I can just touch his clothes, I can just touch his cloak, then maybe I would be healed. And so somehow she worms her way through the crowd, and she gets close enough to Jesus just to touch the tail end of his cloak, and she does that, and she's healed. The only problem is that Jesus knows that this has occurred, and he stops the crowd, and he said, who touched me? And his disciples are like, Jesus, are you crazy? How are we going to figure this out? There's this whole crowd, and everybody's pressing up. I've been touched by like 30 people, Jesus. How are you going to know who touched you? But this woman, Mark says, comes up to Jesus, filled with fear and trembling, and said, it was me. I touched you, Jesus. And Jesus said simply, your faith has made you well. Paul, the Apostle Paul, uses the same pairing of words, fear and trembling, in Philippians chapter 2, verse 12, when he talks about working out our salvation. Now, he doesn't mean that we can work for our salvation. He means Jesus died on a cross, was buried in a tomb, rose on that third day, and we probably ought to live our life in response to this massive gift and this massive difference that Jesus has made in our life. And how do we work out that salvation? How do we live in that response to Jesus on the cross, buried and raised from the dead? With fear and trembling. Now, Paul didn't mean that you would be paralyzed by fear. He didn't mean, in Mark chapter 5, verse 33, Mark didn't mean that this woman was so afraid, so filled with fear, that she couldn't say anything or do anything. In fact, the exact opposite happens. And so sometimes when we get to the end of Mark chapter 16, and we sort of worry about this short ending and these women going off and not saying anything and being filled with fear and trembling, I don't think that Mark means that they stopped doing anything. I think Mark means that they were overcome by the power of the resurrection. And in that moment, speechless. They didn't have anything to say to one another. They'd all been there together. We know from the other gospel accounts that when they find Peter and the other disciples, they let them know that, hey, that tomb is empty. Jesus has been raised from the dead. Now, even the disciples didn't believe them right away. Peter and John famously have this race to the empty tomb. It takes some time. Some of them, Thomas, even longer, until he touches the wounds in Jesus' hand before they are overcome by that power of the resurrection. Man, the power of the resurrection. What does it look like to live in the power of the resurrection? Tim Keller is a preacher. He tells a story about a preacher who went to Italy. And this preacher is in Italy, and he's looking at these graves because preachers are weird. And he's looking at the grave, and there's this grave this guy was buried centuries before. And he was an atheist, but kind of scared of Christianity at the same time. And so he had this giant rock slab laid over his grave. And written on the rock slab were all these warnings warnings that, hey, if there's a resurrection, don't come for me. I don't want any part of it. That sort of sentiment. And he thought this rock slab would protect him from that, eternal destiny, from that resurrection. The only problem is that evidently when he was buried, there was a seed, an acorn that fell into that grave or whatever, or was there. And now, centuries later, there was this huge acorn tree that had grown and split that rock slab in two. And the preacher looked at it and he thought, if this little acorn filled with the biological power can split that slab in two, what could the power of the resurrection do in our lives? Keller says this: the minute you decide to receive Jesus as Savior and Lord, the power of the Holy Spirit comes into your life. It's the power of the resurrection, the same thing that raised Jesus from the dead. Think of the things you see as immovable slabs in your life, your bitterness, your insecurity, your fears, your self-doubts. Those things can be split and rolled off. The more you know him, the more you grow into the power of the resurrection. We can live in the power of the resurrection in response to Jesus' gift to us. The first step is to know Jesus and to know his power, is to follow the example of this young lady this morning and say yes to Jesus in baptism. If you've never said yes to Jesus in baptism, make today that day. We've got it ready, by the way. We can do it today. You can just mark, though, on your welcome home card, there's a little box at the bottom. It says baptism. Just mark that with an X or a check mark. I will talk to you this week about taking those steps to saying yes to Jesus for the first time in baptism. Don't wait any longer. Start living in the power of the resurrection. Or maybe for some of us, we need to start living in the power of the resurrection by meeting with Jesus. After all, that was the first message these women were to convey to Peter and the disciples, wasn't it? Go and meet Jesus in Galilee. And every single one of us has the opportunity on a daily basis to meet Jesus in his word. If you don't have a plan to study through God's word, I have a reading plan. It's one of my favorites on the back table. It's just called the 5 by 5 by 5 plan. It'll take you through a chapter of the New Testament 5 days a week. It's supposed to take 5 minutes to read a chapter. I'm not sure if that's high or low or whatever, but it's not the same to say 10 by 5 by 5. So 5 by 5 by 5. Pick up one of those plans and you can start. It's a year-long plan, right? Just start somewhere. Maybe in the Gospels, John is a great place. It starts with Mark. That would be a fine place to start. The book of Romans is an awesome place to start. Just get started meeting with Jesus daily. Or maybe some of us need to start living in the power of the resurrection by going and telling someone else. Just like these women were to go and tell Peter and the disciples. Maybe we need to grab that invitation card. Picking Up the Pieces is our new series next week, Sunday morning at 9 and 10:30. Take that invitation and invite someone you know to worship with you next Sunday. Or maybe we need to start living in the power of the resurrection just by serving those around us. So many opportunities here. There's stuff in your bulletin about Vacation Bible School this summer. I know Zach and student ministry are looking for youth coaches for camp and all that stuff that's coming up in the summertime. Great opportunities to serve in those ways. The Shelter of Hope is always looking for folks to help. You can come and be a part of that team on Monday nights and Tuesday mornings. Maybe there's all these new moms. I was just struck by this a week or so ago. We've got all these new moms here at Wallula Christian Church, and maybe you know one of those new moms, and you just want to give them a call or send them a text and say, hey, could I bring by dinner one night this week? And just give new mom a new break in her week and just love on that family in that way a little bit. Just start living in the power of the resurrection. I know that power can be intimidating. My wife and daughter, we were just on vacation a month or so ago or whatever, a spring break. We went to the beach, and every morning I would go to the beach early, and I'd have my quiet time on the beach. And one morning I'm walking up to the beach, and there's this red flag flying, and there's a sign. I don't know what the red flag means. I'm from Kansas. And so I go and look and read the sign. It said, it's too dangerous to go in the water if there's a red flag. Knee deep is too deep. And I had just heard the story from a friend who had been to Hawaii, and while they were on vacation, they watched this couple get swept out into the ocean by a riptide, and they did CPR on the terrible story. And I just thought, well, knee deep is too deep. I'm with that. This is as close to the water as I got. Right? I'm good. I'll stay back. right? I understand. You start talking about things like the power of the resurrection, that can be intimidating. Let me reassure you. Man, Jesus loves you so much. He wants to be your friend. He wants you to acknowledge him as Lord. He's made a way for you to do that. It's okay. It's okay. Just like these women, take those steps with fear and trembling. But take those steps. Say yes to him. You can know Jesus, and you can know the power of his resurrection. Let's stand and worship him.